I'm Jen Bradovich. I'm IPCNY's Exhibition and Curatorial Manager, and I worked to translate our spring exhibition reprint 5 projects from an exhibition in our gallery space in Chelsea into an online format. Reprint includes work by Mark Bradford, Cecily Brown, Glenn Brown, Enrique Chagoya, and Lynette Yiadom-Boakye, and the exhibition examines how artists draw from and process visual culture and visual conventions in order to pose new questions and enliven our habits of looking. This is our second event in conjunction with Reprint. In May, we held a discussion between the artist Enrique Chagoya and the printer Bud Shark of Sharks Inc. in Colorado. And if you missed that, you can find it on our website at ipcny.org and also on our YouTube page. So today we have a really special conversation among 4 master printers whose problem solving, vision, and skill were essential to realizing 4 of the projects that are included in Reprint. These works all happen to be etchings, and while it wasn't intentional for IPCNY to do a show that featured etching so heavily, it did get us thinking that a conversation about this medium with these experts might help us understand what's so generative and relevant to artists today about etching. So 2 of our printers work here in New York, where I'm broadcasting from. And 2 of them have joined us from thousands of miles away in the UK. So thank you for spending your hour with them and with us, wherever you're at now. Our program today, it's designed as a conversation. Each panelist will, in just a brief minute each, orient you to the works that they printed that are included in Reprint. Then we're going to kick off the conversation right away. It's going to be moderated by IPCNY's director, Judy Hecker. The Q&A box is going to be available to you throughout the program to ask questions. Some of the questions I will answer behind the scenes in the Q&A box, and some will raise and bring to the panelists during the discussion to answer live. At the end, there's going to be a really quick survey where you can leave us some feedback about what you've seen today. You'll be automatically directed there, so if you can fill it out, it will help us better serve you, our IPCNY community, from home. So let me welcome all of our printers. Erik Hogan worked as a printer in several artist studios and print studios before he joined New York's not-for-profit Lower East Side Printshop in 2011. He's currently artistic director and master printer there and has collaborated with many, many artists on several of the Printshop's special editions, publishing, and contract printing projects. Ian Stedman is director of Arcane Studios in London. It's a vibrant space combining a boutique print studio with a project space and affordable artist studios, which he founded in 2005. He is preparing to open another such space in Devon. Michael Taylor founded his own Paupers press in Hoxton, outside of London, in a former funeral parlor in 1986. In the 34 years since, Paupers Press has worked with a tremendous roster of leading contemporary artists, galleries, and publishers. And Paupers Press has also published under their own name. And Craig Zammiello, master printer at Two Palms here in New York, also brings to the panel way over 30 years of experience in all printmaking techniques. Prior to joining Two Palms in 2002, he was master printer for 25 years at ULAE. And as an educator, he's taught at institutions across New York. So what we have here is a roundtable for you today of exceptional practitioners and artists in their own right, who have a tremendous wealth of experience and knowledge about their craft. If I'm doing the math correctly, we've got over 100 years of combined experience in the room. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists to tell us a little bit about the works that they printed that are included in Reprint, and then we'll kick off our discussion. Take it away, Erik.
The work that's in the show are these photogravure and etchings by Mark Bradford, and we did 2 suites. This is the suite of 16. There was also a suite of 14, and Jennifer gave such a great description of the work on the website, but it's these merchant posters that he kind of collects from the streets around LA, and we had those made into photogravure plates, and then they were collaged onto the background plate, which was, they just started off as, you know, the kind of discarded backs of some etching plates that we had in the studio. And there's, yeah, the left is one of the background plates and the right is the photogravure plate.
So these are Lynette's prints. They're hard ground copper plate etchings. She does a series of them where she prepares a plate and then she adds on her hard ground, smokes it and stuff like that, takes it away, lets the plate get a little bit aged with her traveling backwards and forwards to the studio. And then she creates these portraits of people that are not real people. So they are made up people, but as she is making them through the process in the studio, they do become their own entity, their own personalities, their own histories, and they start having their own stories. Although some of those stories are not shared, they are there in the process of making them and things. Some of them, during the making of them, particularly the one on the left here, who has the side parting, you know, all sorts of things get mentioned about it. You know, it looks like he's getting ready for his wedding and all sorts of things like that.
Okay, so the work of Glenn Brown. Really, this is the first of several projects that we've been working with him on. And they start off as scans from art books, magazines, and this particular set is all Lucian Freud images. So they're scanned and reproduced to the original size. And then on the computer, he layers several images on top of each other. And we ended up with different files, each containing 3 images. And then through the printing process, we then made several plates, each containing 3 images, and then printed up to 3 plates on top. So most of these images are made up of 9 images of Lucian Freud prints in total. And of course, it's through the printing process that it generates the unknown, the unexpected, and reinvigorates all the imagery. You get the sort of moire patterns from the commercial dot that is reproduced. You get the obliteration of some of the detail, particularly around the faces, as you can see, and odd little bits and pieces coming through that are not predicted through the digital process. They come entirely through the etching and the printmaking process. So the printing process is a way of reinvigorating the idea and reinvigorating the images.
This is a group of soft grounds done by Cecily Brown in 2004. I mean, usually with Cecily's work, it takes on more of a free-form dialogue, much more abstract type of image. One thing I've noticed over 20 years of working with Cecily is that her notebooks and sketchbooks have these incredibly masterful rendered images, usually done with ballpoint pens. And we wanted to somehow let the public see that and also give them something different from Cecily's work. In 2016, this was evident at her Drawing Center show. You can see one of her ballpoint pen sketches to the right. And a typical Cecily Brown 6-color etching, excuse me, on the left. So very straightforward, very simple.
Great. Thanks so much, Jen, for the introduction, and thanks to the 4 of you for being here today in across 2 time zones. And we're excited to get right into discussion and emphasize conversations and Q&A. So again, please, everyone out there, send us your questions throughout and we'll answer them. I want to dig right into the issue of etching and why it is so generative for artists today and these particular artists. 4 of the 5 projects in our exhibition are reprint are in fact intaglios, not by design, but I think it isn't a coincidence that there is such a kind of revival or continued interest in this centuries-old technique that Rembrandt loved in the same way that artists today love. And I wanted each of you, if you could, to go in a little bit deeper about etching. What is it about the line? What is it about the technique? It's not an easy technique by any means. Perhaps that's some of the challenge that makes it exciting. So if you could talk about the projects in terms of these artists and just artists generally that you're working with, regarding intaglio. I think it would be interesting to hear. Michael.
Okay. There's obviously different reasons for different artists in how they approach things. But I do think that the physicality of making the etching is something that intrigues people. And the fact that it comes through quite aggressive, corrosive activity is something that people still respond to. I mean, as a student, of course, you stick a plate into a bath of, you know, you're using zinc plate into a bath of nitric and it bubbles away and it looks like some sort of medieval sort of alchemy process. That's interesting and exciting. And artists still respond to that. And when you first take a print off the plate, and particularly if it's got a large area of tonality on it, so there's a lot of ink, it's a beautiful surface. It's actually almost, it's tactile, it has a smell, it's, you know, it's soft to the touch, it's almost edible, and people respond to this. And it's also a very challenging one because depending on the nature of how they make their work, it's a direct process, so the image is coming out of reverse. And that challenges people, and artists like a challenge. They like to sort of, you know, and they also like to engage with something that does have that history. The fact that you can go back to Rembrandt and then Picasso and Gross and whoever it is. There's a continuity that people also respond to. And etching has been used by an extraordinary array of artists, particularly in the 20th century. And there isn't really an area of modern or contemporary art that hasn't been involved in making prints through etching. So it's an incredibly flexible process.
Ian, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, like Mike was saying, it's that sort of physicality of it. It is like a sculpture. It is, you know, it's sort of history comes from armorers who would make suits of armors and design things, and then they'd push paper into it and take it out, and then obviously it came from a 3D form, and now it's going into a more of a 2D form. For Lynette, I mean, that was something that was very important, that sort of physicality, that directness. She's an artist when she does her prints, that she doesn't just make the plate and then asks the printer to make it or do the acid work or stuff like that. She's in there, she's getting her hands in the acid. And when it comes to the actual auditioning, she's auditioning with me. She's getting her hands inked up and that. She's not just doing a proof and then saying, oh, that's fine, and then giving it to the printer to print off. She's doing the whole thing. And she finds that intrinsic into her work. She wants to be part of that. And that is what etching does for people. It is direct. I mean, other forms of printing, screen printing and that, they're slightly more removed. The nice thing about the etching process is once you've got your plate done and you wiped it and then you put it through the machine or the press, something changes in that process. There's a little bit of magic that happens, and people like that. Artists love it.
Nadine just took the words out of my mouth. Thank you for making the comment in the Q&A, because in fact, what Ian just pointed out is on view and has been at the Met for a while, the Renaissance of Etching exhibition, and it's on through July. It's not on at the Met right now, but it's at the Albertina through mid-July. And this in fact outlines the history of etching and how it originated on arms and armor in a three-dimensional format. And then made its way artistically into the more two-dimensional form of the flat etching plate. So there is this very, very rich history that was recently delved into. Erik, what about you and this project in etching and other projects and etching with contemporary artists?
You know, kind of what's been said by both Michael and Ian, but you know, I think about, I've been teaching, you know, at Lower East Side Printshop, the etching class here, you know, for people doing the etching for the first time for, I don't know, 5 or 6 years or something like that. And it's kind of, you know, it's like, in a way, one of, it can be, I hate saying, you know, it's the something, but it can be kind of like the ultimate collaborative thing, depending on how you do it with an artist, because you know, it's almost like I see the same thing out of artists doing it as I see out of people doing it for the first time, which is really cool. It's, you know, like you say, you know, how are you doing it? You put the ground on, you put it in the acid, you wipe it, and something happens to the plate. And then the decision-making kind of has to begin. So it can be just a really cool way to work with people. And yeah, there's something a little more permanent. It forces you to make decisions in a different way than other processes too. Not to say it's better or worse than other processes, but it's not as easy to, you know, change the digital file and, you know, shoot a new screen or something like that. It's like once the plate has that mark, you're kind of committed to it. Mm-hmm. So in terms of collaboration, that doesn't so much speak to this project, but in terms of collaboration, it can be a really fun process for that.
And Craig, how about you?
I think the accessibility, the familiarity to utilizing these tools are a great gateway drug for people that haven't experienced printmaking before. It's something that they can relate to. They make a mark on a plate, get etched, and that mark is, again, seen on paper. It's a pretty straightforward thing. On the other hand, it lends itself to something that can't be, I think, reproduced in any other format. There's a meatiness, if you will, to etching. And unlike engraving, which you can see at the Met right now with the etching show, not right now, but there's a fluidity to those marks that you don't have to use a tool prior to that with engraving. So that's it.
The other thing I wanted to touch on, a couple of things before we open it up to audience questions, is this really interesting tension between this older format and newer formats that are digital, and that really came about in the late 20th century and in the 21st century now. Prints have always been portable, etching plates have always been portable, but with the digital possibilities and working remotely, it takes it to a completely different level. And that's the case in a couple of these projects. I know, well, Erik, you could speak to Mark Bradford's project and how that worked in terms of being on two different coasts and working digitally while also maintaining the tradition of etching. And similarly, Michael, it would be wonderful if you could dive more deeply into the many different steps that you and the artists go through in taking apart and layering the existing Lucian Freud etchings on which his prints are based. And all of you, it would be, you know, equally, even if these, not all the projects involved the digital, but it would be interesting to hear Ian and also Craig speak to that aspect, that kind of tension between the two. So Erik, maybe you want to start this time.
Sure. We did the project as I said, the images are photogravures, and you know, another great thing about etching is it can be can almost be anything. You know, you can get a super photographic image, and it can just be so much more detailed than a lot of other processes because of how small the dot or whatever you use to make the print can be, or the plate can be. And the process, you know, to back up, Judy, we had this conversation initially like a week ago when we first kind of met about this, and I mentioned that Mark was never in the studio for the project. We're here in New York and he's in Los Angeles. And I was just, when reflecting on the project, I was thinking about how great the publisher was. This was published by Michael Jenkins of Sycamore Jenkins. And he was, I think, I'm not taking any credit away from the artist, but as far as I saw, he was kind of a visionary in terms of, you know, seeing this project and what could be done. He'd worked with us in the past, and obviously he knew Mark's work. And he kind of, I think, saw what could be done with these images of Mark's, brought some in, we kind of started talking about them. And, you know, we printed the project, but the photogravures were made by Lothar Osterberg. And I mean, why would we try? I mean, you use the pros to do the, you know, best job. And making the background plates, you know, we needed to come up with 20 background plates, and we had maybe 6 or 8 around the studio, but at some point we needed to make more. So we got a bunch of plates and just started kind of banging them around and stuff like that. So it became a collaborative effort in terms of, you know, anybody that was here in the studio, like interns. I should mention that Jamie Miller was here working at the time as a printer that worked extensively on this project as well. But it, you know, it kind of became, we roughed up a bunch of plates, threw some out in the street outside and whatever, threw some in acid, and then you kind of print them all and put them up on a wall, and then you just start talking about them and getting them to kind of all be at the same level, which is quite challenging, you know. Yeah, so I guess the point was kind of, it was a big collaborative effort on, you know, not only, you know, from us, other print shops, and the publisher, you know, and, you know, these big, huge projects like this, you know, having a publisher really put money and effort behind getting it made is, you know, how these things happen.
Great. Michael, if you can unpack for us how Glenn Brown takes apart, morphs, combines, layers digitally, and then on the etching plates also. It's still a mystery to me how it all happened. And I know problem solving really factored into this project for you. If you could give us an idea, and just, you know, as background, everyone I think can see who knows Lucian Freud's etchings that these were based on particular etchings that he had been seeing in catalogs and such, and wanted to delve into what it meant to reproduce, obliterate, and otherwise toy with a great 20th century printmaker's images, to see them in a kind of new light. And that, of course, relates to the artist's paintings as well. But etching is really different for him than painting. So tell us how he arrived at these incredibly layered images.
I think it is important to understand that Glenn's work has always come from student days, from sourcing other art forms, other images, other painters, and his is a practice. I mean, I'm not qualified to go into any deep conceptual sort of understanding of it, but you know, it is something that is related to how we see and perceive the world through art, and the uniqueness or otherwise of it. And of course, we see most of the time art through reproduction, through magazines, through art books, things like that. Certainly a lot of it we do. And so he wanted to have something that had a purity in terms of how it is perceived. So they are just scanned from usually quite low resolution images. And then they're blown up to the correct image size. So they're life size to the original works. And he would just have a whole load of them. And of course, in the actual project, there were 3 artists altogether. There was Lucian Freud, Urs Graf, who is quite often referenced as the first person to make etchings, whether that's true or not, I'm not sure, and Rembrandt. And they were all treated in the same way, that they were layered, one image was layered on top of another image on the computer screen. And early on, we had a discussion about how far that process should go. And the first tests were done with 8, 9, 10 images layered at the computer at the digital stage, and with Maker Plate. And these are all actually photogravures as well. And the problem with those, we found, was that the density of black that you were getting obliterated everything. So you'd just have this sort of periphery around the edge, the sort of flotsam of the image, and then just a very solid black lump in the center. And at that stage, there was a very, very simple process that took place. Each of the films, each of the images was a separate film. And then they were layered on top of each other, on top of the plate as we were making it. But then when we had all the films out on the etching press and they were just there, Glenn sort of saw that you got more detail if you took images away. So you ended up with less. There was more detail coming through. So at that point, we split it into 3 plates, each containing 3 images layered on top. And that just allowed each of those plates to have more detail, more texture, more tonality, and more of the history of the image in it. And of course, at that point, when we started printing over the top, the very classic thing about when you're working, what I find working with an artist is problematic when they're working digital and then we're printing in an analog, in a handmade process, is that the digital is a backlit cinematographic or cinematic image. So you see it with this sort of backlight. And when it's printed onto a piece of white paper, it is no longer backlit in the same way. So there is a natural transformation of the image at that point, and which sometimes for people can be disappointing. They're used to this sort of brightness coming through and the clarity that can come through. And so that was always a danger. But what you got instead was that the printing process threw up these sort of happy accidents, such as the Mori pattern, where you put 2 halftone screens out of kilter with each other on top, and it creates this pattern that doesn't exist anywhere other than through the printed process. And that changes the nature of the. You also had the way the thickness of the ink, the blackness, and particularly when it's first peeled off the press, you can hear the ink peeling away, and that added another sort of level of interest for the artist, and which is something he then started to manipulate. So the process itself created a new language for him to start manipulating. So he then went back and started investing in the original digital work.
It'd be interesting, Craig, to hear, how you and how Two Palms are integrating, the digital with the traditional, but also talk about Cecily's, and as part of this, we can look closely at her etchings and the sketchbooks that she used, because in some ways, for her, the digital has no place in this project. It really is about the artist's sketchbook and translating that pen into an etched line. So maybe you could address both at the same time.
Well, at Two Palms, we've been for 15, 20 years now, utilizing lasers to burn ground off of etching plates, then applying aquatint to them. We print hard grounds on using UV flatbed printers. We utilize digital as a tool if it's going to help us and work as much as possible. On the other hand, for some of the artists, we go straight 17th century, roll on hard ground, smoking the plates, straight etching. And so we run the whole gambit at Two Palms. For this project, though, with Cecily, I've always noticed her notebooks and her ability to utilize a big pen or a ballpoint pen or a biro, as they call in Great Britain and Europe, to get shading. And she's an incredibly elegant renderer with ink. And if you take, the classic big pen and you start to hold it sideways, you can develop in a halftone method the mimicry of shading with it. So we wanted to get a way to have her work directly on the plate, get that feeling of her reference material that she utilizes. And I'm not going to get into the concepts of it. Jennifer Farrell did that so much better. But we worked out a way of using very thin coats of 45-year-old Charbonnel soft grounds and a type of architectural paper, and etching them for literally 45 seconds in a ferric chloride bath. And they came up with this pretty darn close capture of one of her sketches in her notebook reference materials. You also see these kind of swipey things like in the lower print That's actually just her thumb going right over the paper. So in the actual drawing transfer, it doesn't exist, but it did lift the ground. That's, you know, that's about it, unless you want me to get more into nuts and bolts, like how the Bic pen was developed by a man named Marcel Bic in France in 1950. Things like that.
For next time. And Ian, I'll go to you and then we'll open it up to some audience questions, but how does or doesn't the digital factor in, you know, to your practice? And do you have a sense that artists feel using digital changes their perception of their own work, or potentially the viewer's perception of a work, or is it just another tool?
Well, ultimately it is another tool, but I found that it's more the buyer or possibly a gallery who will say, well, I don't feel I can charge what I can for an etching than I can for a digital print. Those perceptions are changing. Digital printmaking is becoming more known to have its own part within it, the printing world process and things. As for individual artists, I'm seeing more and more artists now come through the studios that are joining the two processes together. So you'll have people who will do an initial image on a print using an Epson printer with certain papers and inks, and then they can actually use that as a base paper for printing an etching plate on top of. So they're mixing it together. So they're avoiding a certain type of chincolé practice, but using it more as a digital practice with a etched plate on top. Also nice new things with like solar plates, or I think do you call them solar plates in America? I'm not sure if you do. Where people are now printing directly from a digital printer onto the actual solar plate. So they're avoiding having to have a film or anything like that. And then they'll be able to process the solar plate as they normally do. But what it's doing is it's changing how they can react and interact with that solar plate. So things are always moving and changing, which is integral to it. For Lynette, she's not interested in the digital in that sense. You know, she's always, when she sees obviously her prints reproduced in books or magazines and stuff, they don't have that same quality, and that's what why she does traditional based etching, because she wants that quality.
There's an interesting question that touches on an important issue. Do any of you work with artists who are experienced printmakers themselves? And if so, how is that different? We know there are different levels of collaboration. Some artists will come into a studio and make their first print with you. Others will have attained printmaking knowledge by working at other workshops. So yeah, anyone take that one, either with these particular artists that we're discussing, or any artists, about the different levels of experience and how that affects the process, the collaboration, your approach.
Yeah, I mean, I deal with a few artists who are considered printmakers. A lot of the artists that we get coming through are given through galleries or commercial bodies that ask that artist to do a print, and they do that way. But there are a few artists who are considered printmakers, someone like Chris Orr or Norman Ackroyd, people like that. That is their predominant work. Most of the time, they don't need to use any other printmakers, because that's their medium. They have their own presses, they have their own studios. Now and then they do use printers to help do their editioning work and things like that. And the experience with them is really rewarding, because you're learning from an artist that has gone down their own route or own branch and specialized in their own way, certain techniques or tactics or ways of expressing themselves with their work in that particular form of etching. And they know the medium, they know the materials. So you don't have to explain why things need to dry, or why things have to take so long, or why you have to do something in front of something else and things like that. That's already there. So what you're actually learning is more about why they're doing that thing, why they're using those materials for it. And that's really exciting for printmaking. And that's where that lovely collaboration happens, where if you have an artist that's maybe not so familiar with the print process, they're relying on you much more as a printmaker to enable them to know those certain processes or materials. So it's a kind of a flip reversal mode in that sense, for me anyway.
Michael, do you want to add anything on that topic?
Yeah, I mean, I generally, for many years, have rarely worked with people who would be called printmakers. Many of them have made a lot of prints, and they sort of almost accidentally acquire knowledge, slightly in a way that they'd rather not, strangely. But they do acquire knowledge about how they want things done and whatever. But they don't necessarily acquire enough of the technical skill to do it. But what they do know is their idea and their art. They know their language and they know how they want it to articulate. And they learn how to do it through whoever's working with them. And I think that in the past, when I first started the studio, and I did work with a lot of printmakers, I found it slightly problematic because as a printmaker myself, you pick up very personal, idiosyncratic ways of using processes and materials, particularly when it comes to printing. And those things it's a bit like a painter. It's very intuitive, and when it's for yourself. And it's very difficult to understand. I found it very difficult to understand. So we quite often found we were working against each other. If it was on the plate making side, there were certain technical things that I might be able to do that they couldn't do, and that's absolutely fine. But generally speaking, I did find it just a different type of working relationship, one that didn't always sit comfortably with either of us. And strangely enough, I found it easier dealing with people who know their work, who know their ideas, who know their aesthetics, who, everything like that, but they may not know the process well enough to do it. If they were on a desert island and you just had a press and whatever, they'd get on, they'd learn. But part of the interest for them to do it through studios like mine or Erik's or Ian's or whatever is that it's a different working relationship, and they're able to, because artists, contemporary artists many of them work across many different fields anyway. They're doing sculptures, they're doing videos, they're doing film, they're doing whatever it is. So they're not unused to working with different people. And it's just another set of people to communicate with. And it creates a different type of working practice for them, I think. But people do pick up things, and they do pick up, and they do direct you. Certainly there's a number of people over the years I've worked with who, there's one in particular who's done a lot of live things. He can walk rings around in terms of knowledge, because he's worked with the biggest studios there are around the world. And since the 60s, you name it, he's worked there. And he used to teach the subject. And he's very nerve-wracking for me to work with. It doesn't happen very often, but because he has that knowledge. So it's a very different working relationship with him. But generally speaking, most of the artists I work with, the printmaking side of it is not their primary concern.
And Erik, what about at the Lower East Side Printshop? It's a little bit of a different model because you publish, you also do contract printing, you have residency programs. And so tell us a little bit about that, the contract versus the experience with contract printing versus publishing and collaboration.
Yeah, well, I mean, the contract printing and publishing can often kind of be the same thing. That usually involves the artist coming in and, us collaborating to make a print. And I think, like what's been said before, typically the artists we work with are, artists that are coming in to collaborate. They aren't printmakers. They're not, I mean, it's even like a label thing. They're not calling themselves a printmaker, even though, maybe, right, they've been collaborating longer than I've been alive or something like that in some cases. But I like to think of it, maybe this kind of goes back a little to that conversation that always seems to come up in printmaking, this digital thing. What's the digital? And I think of digital kind of the same way. I think of collaboration and all this stuff. They're all tools, you know. And I kind of think in a way of myself as like the hand or a tool to an artist, and they're being the head, you know. And it works the best when there's those two kinds of roles. I think when they come in with an idea or not come in with an idea, or just are open to seeing what happens. And if you're caught up in, you know, because I'm an artist too, right? And I make prints, but when you're concerned with doing the things I do in the studio, that's not what you should be thinking about as an artist when you're in here. You shouldn't be thinking about technical things so much, unless you want that to be part of the process. So, you know, really like, you know, we work with artists that are, that we have a lot of fun with that, you know, it's easy to make a screen print, let's say, but they're like, how do we make it not good? You know, and sometimes that's the most rewarding and can be the most challenging thing, you know, and that leads to all different kinds of marks and gestures and that kind of thing. I kind of went, I don't know, I trailed off.
No, that's good. There's another interesting question, and maybe Craig, you could take this from Paul. How long did each of these projects take to come to fruition from beginning with the artists and sometimes with the publisher to being released? That etching is a slow and intensive project. Editioning is intensive. We know all that. So take us a little bit into each one of your workshops and tell us, you all have different models, different scaled workshops, different numbers of staff working there. You know, when you collaborated, for instance, on the projects that are in reprint, were you working on other projects simultaneously? Is it waiting for the artist? Is it done sort of in depth over a 1 month period? Take us a little bit into the studio and tell us what it's like to actually work, you know, with the artists on these projects, issues like duration, etc.
Well, at Two Palms, there's never a clock running. An artist can work for years on a project, and if it results in a work that is published at the end, that's fantastic. But if it doesn't, it's just part of the background that is built. And again, I mean, this is subjective to each artist. Every person's different. Over 40 years of doing this, I've met artists that come in with an idea. They're able to immediately put it down. We have a direction, we go through it, we finish it, we edition it, we publish it. There are other artists that come in not quite having an idea or a direction for a project, and it takes off, and different roads are gone down, and it takes a long time. Things happen accidentally sometimes. We might make complete U-turns on projects. It's one of the beauties of a studio where you invite an artist in to and give them free rein. And that's one of the beauties of Two Palms. They come there to experiment and to work out their artistic problems and get solutions. And we're along for the ride, and I wouldn't have it any other way. It's a wonderful situation to be in. So
that's true. Ian, you're a little bit more boutique. Tell us what it's like in your shop.
Well, it's a bit of a mixture of things. I have a sort of membership scheme where you can have your average artist or someone who's never done printmaking before come in and learn how to print, or just do their own practice because they don't have a press themselves. And then I have the part of it where it's more based where galleries or museums will come and ask an artist to do an edition that will sponsor some sort of event that they're doing, and they will say, well, we need it within 2 months or so. How long does the artist need to be with you, and so on? Well, I tend to leave that for the artist to decide. It's their work. But I said I can work with them for 2 months, 3 months, however long it wants. Or if the artist already has an idea and then they just want to give me the thing and reproduce it, then I can do that as well. The best bit is when the artist is willing to come in, try something a bit different, play around, explore, and they're not just in there on their own, they're in there with other people. So I have students from different universities who will come in. and you know, they're just in their first year or second year of their education, and then they're working alongside someone who's more established, maybe someone like Lynette, and they're seeing someone who's a role model for them making their work, and vice versa. That artist is being able to interact with a student right next to them, and they're all on the same level played field. You know, the nice thing about a print room, it is very leveling for everyone, and they both sides get an awful lot from it in that sense.
There's a really important question that I want to read to you in full, and then we can address it as best as we can from an attendee. I'm an educator at a U.S. arts college. Etching has a rich, beautiful history, but history especially favors etchings by white men. Has anyone approached the conceptual issue of etching's colonial, European, or simply white male history? Yes, women and Black, Indigenous people of color are making etchings now, but when teaching the history, how can the conversation lift up marginalized voices better? I don't know if any of you do teaching on the side, and if your workshops and their goals and missions are addressing this. I think it's beginning to be addressed, and but I don't think that it's there yet in any way, shape, or form. I wonder if anyone wanted to address any inroads that you personally or your workshop or you feel the field is making in this area or isn't making.
If I could just, one of the things that I'm involved with, the studio is part of a larger studio complex here. We have different sort of artist studios and workshops, and we have a gallery. And one of the things that we do is we run a sculpture award. And it's one of the largest in the UK of its type. And it's about promoting or finding an artist who is unrepresented, but who's started to make a mature body of work and is starting to warrant a bigger audience. And we try and provide that audience so that somebody will take them on and do something with them. You know, we don't represent artists or anything like that. And it cropped up in the latest application from somebody questioning how many people of different ethnicity had either won or selected or were on the selection panel. And the one thing that, first of all, everything is done sort of blind. So we have no idea about anybody's background whatsoever. We don't even ask age. And so it was an easy thing in one sense to allay their concerns, which they fully accepted and whatever. You know, we've had a very mixed range of people, both as selectors and as shortlisted and as winners. But what it did bring up was something that when I taught for 20 years in different colleges, and we do a lot of education stuff, like I suspect everybody does, and we have college visits and whatever. There is an issue, certainly in the UK, and I suspect we're not unique in that you're not getting a very representative group of people and range of people coming through the education process. And so that at colleges, at undergraduate level, you may get a broader range of people. But by the time it gets to postgraduate, you're certainly not in the UK most of the time. There's a few colleges for very specific reasons, either locality or financial. But by and large, you're not getting people coming through. So if you're not getting people coming through who are trained, who are part of that, they're not going to feed into the gallery system, the professional system, and it's harder and harder for people to be seen and recognized. So I think there is an issue. Undoubtedly, there's an issue. And I think it's a roots and branch issue. It's not a printmaking issue. It's a cultural, it's a social one, and it's an educational one. One that, you know, I suspect everybody's willing to address if we knew how to address it, but we're not in that sort of position, I suspect. I mean, I can certainly name through, and I suspect everybody can, but I think it would be slightly uncomfortable to go through lists of artists and say their ethnic background, their cultural background, their sexuality and things like that. but it's certainly broad range, but it reflects, I think, the percentages reflect the broader issue about how people come through the education process, certainly in the UK. I don't know what Ian feels, because you're obviously coming across and seeing it as well in terms of the UK. But I certainly get the sense that there's a point at which, and I think there's very, very different reasons, a whole load of reasons, but nothing to do with the arts or education or the institutions, that people don't become involved or drop out or not encouraged to carry on. But there are also institutional reasons as well.
I think
Craig.
I think Two Palms has a very diverse group of artists, and over the years has produced some really landmark pieces that address these cultural questions, such as Ellen Gallagher's Deluxe in 2003, right up to presently a large-scale group of silk screens done by Nona Faustine on U.S. monuments. So it's there. I think it's not a conscious effort on our part. It's just something that Two Palms has in mind subconsciously. So.
But I think too, it's women went through this, women printmakers, and at mid-century they started to break through, and there were the greats, and then some of those, there were training grounds and training programs and mentoring, whether formally or informally, and so in recent decades, women printmakers, master printers, are far more prevalent than they once were, but it's getting that pipeline going, and those informal and formal mentorships and apprentice programs. And I think it's a really important topic. It's different than having a diversity of artists in the stable, but an actual diversity of printers who are trained. And I think it goes back to art school and other things. It would be a really interesting topic to explore. So I'm glad the question was raised. We're an all-white, you're an all-white male panel. That wasn't by design. We've had panels that are more diverse along gender and ethnic lines. This was generated by the fact of what was in the show, but that in and of itself is symptomatic of something bigger that I think we've identified. Let's see if there are any other, we've got just a few minutes left. Do any of you want to ask questions of one another? We've got some technical questions if you don't, but the four of you are rarely in a room together like this. Any questions you want to ask one another?
I'd certainly be intrigued to go to Two Palms and be shown all your layering of very thin grounds and the laser cutting through and whatever. I have a very big sort of notebook that I would bring along in my sort of little camera. So I'll be very intrigued by that. Is that the thing?
Come by anytime.
There's a really good question. I think there's so much interest still in Mark Bradford's set, Erik, about the plates and how they were distressed and who made the choices. And there's a question here. Did Erik, for Mark Bradford's work, try out a variety of plate backs before choosing the ones used in the series? I'm interested in the process of trying to sort the manufacture, the look of unintentional mark making. And there has been a lot of questions. There have been a lot of questions surrounding how those marks were made. So yeah, tell us about, because it is a prominent part of the work.
I mean, like I said, it was a collaborative effort here at the studio, just investigating different, I know we did some open biting, just throwing the plate in copper, and they were just nothing special. They were copper plates. They weren't anything special. And I mean, if you look closer, you can see there's definitely some dragging and digging marks and open bite. I don't know what else. I do remember taking some, we're in Midtown here. I mean, not like that matters. There's concrete everywhere, but we did take them outside and drag them in the street a little bit because it looked a little different than the floor here. But, in my experience, a lot of times doing something like this, these abstract things can be kind of some of the most challenging things to do. you know, it's hard to give a formula for how you make something that starts from nothing, that's abstract, you know, kind of sing together when it's shown with another group of 6 or 14 prints. So it was really, I mean, imagine if you had to do it, I don't know, what would you do? Kind of throw them and dig them and, you know, whatever.
And maybe just finally, before we wrap up, each of you, I know I see that Michael's in the studio and you have some new works. If you could just say in a minute or less each what you're currently working on, or what you were working on, what you hope to resume, and when you think that'll happen in your shops.
Well, behind me are actually the end of the most recent Glenn Brown project. It was being printed, but it's purely accidental. It happened to be there. And they are big lino cuts. And they are, again, they're laser cut, I think it was in the end. And that was, we went through lots of different types of materials to get the quality that he wanted. But the main project we're working on at the moment is very large. Is length, width, with Harry, that was due to be launched in New York in June, I think, or pretty much now, which obviously isn't happening. But luckily enough, we signed it off the week before lockdown. And the 2 guys I work with here have just started back in the last 2 weeks. So we are just about keeping the publisher happy. Not very happy, but just about happy. So that's what we've got going on.
Sorry, Erik, you're actually back into in the studio now. So tell us, what are we seeing behind you, and tell us what's brewing or being picked back up.
The shared studio. So we have, this is a shared studio, but anybody can rent daily, weekly, or monthly. And the key holders are also have access, as well as the classes here. And we have a private studio that way that we're working in. And what we're doing this, kind of catching up on some stuff. We published a suite of prints by Arturo Herrera that we're still working on editioning. Just before the break, we finished a new print with Derek Adams that we didn't publish, that Hougen published, that they were going to launch at the Frieze Art Fair. Derek's got to come sign, and we're constantly trying to edition this Jeffrey Gibson suite of prints that Sigma Jenkins has published. Some other stuff too, but yeah, Jeffrey Gibson and Arturo is what we've been kind of working on this week. I think you're muted again.
Thanks. Ian, what about you real quickly? What do you have brewing?
Well, nothing until July. Got another edition with Lynette for her solo show at Tate, which was supposed to be happening at the moment, but it's been put back until the autumn. So that will be the first week of July, be sorting Lynette's stuff out. And got a few more photographers now who are more interested in doing sort of photographic-based etching work, so more sort of photogravure type things. That's the sort of immediate future, and then there's obviously the usuals, universities and stuff like that, who send people over who want to do things, and other art galleries and stuff. But yeah, in the short term.
And Craig, what do you guys have cooking?
Well, the usual suspects. We have some new young artists that we're working with, and hopefully we'll be able to get back in the studio with them as soon as possible. Next week, I think we're going to start staggering some time and getting back to projects that were kind of dropped. Just let me touch one thing, because I'm an educator also. Almost 85 to 90% of my printmaking students are women. So that's a good thing. And it's been that way for the last 7, 8 years. So.
Yeah, and I wanted to add, when we were talking about that too, we have our keyholder residency, and we have our studio renters, and we have our interns here, you know, among other programs. But the applicants for all those are, I mean, like you say, Craig, 70% women, so almost always 70% women. keep at it. Yeah, we love
to, to engage a tired cliche, some of our best master printers are women.
Yeah, absolutely.
There.
Jen's going to wrap it up for us. There was an early question from David Lazary asking if Craig was going to play music, and the answer is next time. You got it. Art. We're going to get him to play some music next time for sure. There's still some questions, and I think we're going to continue to organize panels like this, and maybe we'll ask for your questions in advance and organize a panel around that. But I'm going to turn it over to Jen, who's going to wrap up for us.
Thank you, Judy, and thank you, Craig and Ian and Michael and Erik for this conversation, and for all of you who tuned in to watch on your lunch break, and for sending these questions. A lot of them came in at the end, and unfortunately we don't have time, but if you would like your question answered, if it is burning, reach out to us, send it to Jen, Jenn, at ipcny.org, DM us, reach us at contact@ipcny.org, get your question asked, and we will try to answer it. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on the survey. It's opening in a browser tab as we speak, and make sure that you're following us on Instagram at IPCNY and checking our website for resources for artists who are affected by COVID-19 and for updates on our program, IPCNY at Home. We can't wait to be back in Chelsea with you. Until then, thank you for coming here, being with us today. Stay safe, stay healthy, and stay in touch, everybody. Thank you.